Welcome, all you wiretappers out there. Well, I'm in my temporary winter studio while winter rages up in Kansas City. I just noticed that the low for this coming day or two is going to be around 5-6 degrees above zero and maybe go down to zero at night. So be jealous, man. Be jealous. We have a guest today who is an acclaimed historian, journalist, and author. Has written several historical narrative books, which I find an interesting form. Russell Shorto. Russell, welcome to the show.
Thanks. Great to be with you.
Now, you've written, I think it looked like one of your first book was The Island at the Center of the World, which was a narrative history of the early Dutch founders of Manhattan. Was that your first book?
No, actually, my first book was called Gospel Truth. It was about the historical Jesus. It was about biblical scholarship.
Oh, interesting. I guess they didn't really pump that up when I was searching you on the internet. But
The Island at the Center of the World is the one that, that was my bestseller. So that's the first one that got wide notice.
That's why it gets pumped up. Well, that's interesting. The historical Jesus, I've read some of those different things, and I always find that fascinating. I went to Israel once, and it's a fascinating place, man. It's just I don't know, to separate fact from fiction and stories from myths and reality is just never-ending speculation in there.
If you are a lover, I mean, you don't even have to be a religious person. If you're a lover of history, Israel just boggles the mind being there.
Yes. Yeah. I'm not particularly religious person, but the history is just, like you say, boggles your mind. Yeah. Anyhow, you also wrote a Descartes' Bones, Amsterdam, a history of the world's most liberal city. I bet there's a lot of people agree with that today. And Revolution Song, which I found it's described as a first-rate intellectual history, and it's the story of the founding of our country, in which you use letters, diaries, and other writings from the early settlers and people that founded United States, I guess, around the time of the Revolution in the middle of the 1700s. And you make that into story form. That would be I wish they had those kind of histories when I was taking high school history. It'd been a lot more interesting.
Well, that one was, my idea was to take 6 people from different walks of life, a slave, a woman who was the daughter of a British officer, Native American, from different walks of life, who all lived through the Revolutionary War, and weave their stories together. So you get kind of, it's not just from the perspective of the guys in the white powdered wigs.
Yeah, I heard a guy describe something like that to me as, we always look at all the blood and guts and battles going down the river. Well, what about all the people along the sides of the river? What was going on in their lives? That's what's important.
That's it. Yeah, that's it. Yeah. So that's what I tried to do. The trickiest thing with that was to find people who, like a slave, for example, whose life was well documented enough that I could, recreate it. So I found, I sifted through a lot of what they call slave narratives. And one, this guy dictated his, Venture Smith, his name was, he dictated his life story. He was taken in slavery in Africa, brought to America, lived his whole life in slavery, eventually bought his freedom, lived through the war. And so his is a remarkable story.
Yeah, that would be, to find those stories. The slave narratives, I did. My first documentary was about slave life in Missouri. Oh. And to find those slave narratives was I had not even heard of them before I did that. And it was a find to be able to, I had actors then record bits and pieces from different Missouri slaves to illustrate what that life was like. Yeah, those are invaluable resources for a historian.
Yep.
Well, we're here to talk about your most recent book. And of course, all my fans out there, the wiretappers out there, love the mob. And you wrote a book about your family history, which includes some mob activity. The title is Smalltime, A Story of My Family and the Mob. Now, you have some immense historical narrative skills that you put to work, I got a feeling, in this family story. And you had resources that were what do you call that, firsthand, or there's primary sources for sure.
Yep. Yeah, it turns out there's a lot. This is about my grandfather and his brother-in-law, who ran kind of the mob franchise in my hometown, Johnstown, Pennsylvania. And those guys are dead and gone. So it was actually a relative, my mother's cousin, who I later learned had been a numbers runner and worked in the pool hall for them. He was in his 80s and said to me, "Hey, you're the writer in the family. Why don't you write this story?" And it had never been in my mind to do that, because we all kind of grew up knowing it, but also knowing, we don't talk about that.
Yeah.
So I was kind of an obedient son, and I grew up not even really thinking about it much. But once he said that, Frank, his name is, and once he said to me, "Hey, what are you going to do about the story about your grandfather and the mob?" It kind of broke down that little wall that I had built up in my mind. And I realized all those guys are dead and gone. This is history. I should do what I can to try to get it while there's still something there. And Frank, then put out the word among his old pals who had, these are old guys, and at the time, they were the kids who looked up to these guys and admired them and wanted to be like them. And so we met several times at Panera Bread, their hangout. And, they would tell me all these stories. And the first meeting, it was 4 hours long. I recorded the whole thing.
Yeah.
And then, as you say, I write nonfiction. So I wasn't just going to write a book that's made up of a bunch of old memories, which, as we all know, are not necessarily accurate. So I then went about, I filed FBI Freedom of Information Act requests, and my dad was friends with the chief of police in town. And so he gave me access to the police records and the county courthouse. And, so I was able then to find this underlayer of solid data and stitch that together with these stories.
Interesting. I've been reaching out to some different children of and grandchildren of mob people. I get contacted by children and grandchildren of people in Kansas City, because I worked organized crime, and they think I know something more than what many times that I know. And they've listened to the podcast, and every one of them talked about their childhood and how confusing it was, what they heard about their relative and what they knew of them personally. And I'm putting together a show with some interviews. I've got one guy who's the son of a man that's become a friend of mine, and he wants to write his own book about his upbringing. So I want to put together a show. I'll probably put this show kind of maybe in conjunction if I can get that going. I've got 2 or 3 of them that said they'd give me some sound bites to talk about their childhood and those secrets that they kept and how confusing that was for them. So I appreciate you coming on and sharing your story.
Well,
I noticed
when you say that, that brings to mind how people in my family, for the most part, were interested in, if they knew something, in sharing it with me, but they were also interested in what I found, because everybody knew a little something.
Yeah.
It was just whispers. But the idea that I was going to try to put all this together into one story, put it in the context of its time and all that, even though there were people who knew a lot more than I did about certain things, they were all curious what I was going to come up with, because they'd never tried to put it all together, to figure it out. Because when it's all whispers, what do you got? What are you talking about?
Oh yeah, the last one was the niece of a guy that owned 2 or 3 strip clubs that were connected, and she got hold of me, and I said, I don't know much more. I remember the guy, and I remember he was a victim of an extortion attempt, and he was connected to the mob. And I said, let's do an Freedom of Information Act request, and I did. And for some reason, I got it back real quick, and there was like, I don't know, hundreds and hundreds of pages, and they didn't even charge me any extra. It was over whatever it was, a 50-page limit. It was somehow easy for him to get. And I looked at it and like, oh my God, this guy was like working to line up all the strip clubs in the bi-state area, and because so the mob could have a piece of all of them, and the FBI had run a big investigation. And I kind of remember that, but I wasn't really part of that. And so I sent those to her, and she said, "Oh my gosh, I'll have to take some days to digest this." It was
it can be overwhelming.
Yeah, it was for her.
Yeah,
it's been 2 weeks. I haven't heard back from her.
She's digesting it.
Really, sometimes I was a little nervous about it, because sometimes people don't really want to hear some of that stuff, but
right.
But maybe they do too.
Yeah, there's definitely that.
So this was about a small mob family who operated in Johnstown, Pennsylvania, which I read up on it, and I've heard of Johnstown. It was like a factory town, a really rough and tough, brawling kind of probably had a big automotive factory and steel factories. And
it was
and
mainly
like
steel, the steel mill, coal mines on the outskirts and steel mills in town. And back in the day when it was really rollicking, they called it Little Chicago.
Oh, really? Huh? Now, who were they controlled by? Were they out of New York? Were they kind of, or Pittsburgh? Were they kind of the little brother?
They were connected to Pittsburgh.
Pittsburgh, okay.
Yeah, this is in the orbit of Pittsburgh, and all around there, Johnstown, Altoona, Braddock, New Kensington, Greensburg, all those towns. People don't realize how much how all over the country, small, medium-sized towns had their kind of mob franchise going.
Really, and it's really based out of Prohibition. I would assume it was a big. Were your relatives involved in the liquor?
My grandfather's life tracks that whole development of the mob. His parents emigrated from Sicily. They, were like in the mining town. They were restricted. Then finally they moved into downtown, and his father was murdered. And his mother's left to raise 9 children. Prohibition comes in. She's got a still operating in the house, and he's out selling Coke bottles stoppered up with moonshine. She was busted once and spent time in prison, but she was doing it there was a local guy, kind of a pre-mob neighborhood figure who had. I think the impression I get is he had all these different stills going in different houses, and he kind of controlled them, and they paid to him. Then by the end of Prohibition, my grandfather's a young man, and just like what was happening around the country, he has shifted his income stream from booze to gambling. And he was at that time running card games out of the trunk of his car. And there are several arrests for that when he was young. And then another guy comes from the Philly mob, and he seems to have been given the job to kind of start the franchise in Johnstown. He meets my grandfather's sister. They get married, and my grandfather was the local guy who knew the scene. So they formed a partnership, and that then became the basis for the thing. And really from World War II into the 60s, that was their heyday.
Now, was that this Joseph Regino?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. And your grandfather was his brother-in-law.
That's right.
All right,
Yeah.
I get those connections. Can't tell the players without a scorecard sometimes in these crime families. You got to figure out how they're related.
Yeah, and my grandfather I was named after. Russ Shorto was his name. Yeah.
And so gambling definitely was a cash cow of organized crime, the Italian-based La Cosa Nostra, mafia, whatever you want to call it, organized crime throughout the whole United States after Prohibition. And so what form did that take? I noticed in Francis Ford Coppola made a couple of statements about he said this is remembrance of his grandfather and great uncle's lives of slots, pinball machines, tip seals, skeeched dice, and places like the Melodee House and City Cigar. Melodee Lounge and City Cigar. Now what is a tip seal?
Tip seals were kind of like a lottery ticket. It was a board. All these guys described it to me. It was a board that they would get, and they would have a number of these different seals like tickets on them. And you would buy one. There were different prices. And instead of scratching it, you'd pull it off. And if your number matched the number underneath, then you won, $1 or $5 or whatever. So people played those all the time.
The original scratcher.
But the centerpiece of their operation was a numbers game. They called it the GI Bank, and I think they named it after giving it kind of a patriotic feel to honor the returning troops or something. So the GI Bank, like half the town played it. Everybody over a certain age who I interviewed in town knows all them, played the GI Bank, knew what was going on. This was all wide open. Everybody. This was considered kind of a public utility. And I think it's interesting. I'd be interested in your take on this. The rise and fall of the mob, especially in towns like this, where it's really based on gambling as entertainment, tracking that against the rise of television in the U.S. 1950, 5% of U.S. households had a TV. by 1960, 90% did. And that is really their arc. That was their heyday, the 50s, you know. And as more people are staying home watching Jackie Gleason or whatever,
Yeah.
they don't have to go out and, you know, play the numbers or whatever else they're doing for you know, a little entertainment.
That is an interesting not correlation, but a comparison. And you know, there's a lot. I remember when I was a kid, my dad would go out and Saturday night, and we'd ask him, well, where's Daddy going? And Mom would say, oh, he's going downtown to shoot the bull. And he was just going downtown to, you know, there wasn't any TV, and he would just go downtown and just talk with the other men. And he wasn't a big drinker or anything, but he'd go downtown and just socialize with other men. And when you get a lot of men together, that's where you're going to get gambling. That's for sure.
Yep.
Every time. And you know, and during that time, sports gambling wasn't such a big deal. I think if you think about it, television comes in and sports becomes the mainstay of television, and sports gambling takes over. The numbers goes out. They were barely running numbers in Kansas City in 1971 when I came on the police department. It was mainly just poor people, and of course the government got into the scratchers and basically the numbers pretty quickly by the 80s, I'd say. But sports gambling became the deal. It seemed to me like horse racing. Did they have a race wire there in horse racing?
Yep, they had the ticker tape, and they did starting in the 40s. They were big on boxing and baseball. But you're right. I think it's really in the 60s that sports kind of takes over from a lot of these other things. Another thing that they had was pinball. They owned a pinball machine company, and it was really common to use pinball for gambling. You know, and the way it worked essentially is you win free games when you're playing. And what you would do if you rack up 10 free games or whatever, you'd then go up to the bartender. The house was in on it, you know, wherever the pinball was. So you go up to the bartender and he'd give you $5 or whatever that your winnings equated to. And then he would split that with the boys. You know, that's how they, and the beauty of that is it's a form of gambling. There's no product involved. You know, it's not like the IRS can say, where are those packs of chewing gum or whatever, you know, the Cupid balls or something, you know. It was just, these are free games, and you just reset the machine, and you know, nobody's the wiser.
Wow. Now, did they do many slot machines? You know, Frank Costello in New York was huge in getting slot machines out throughout the United States. And they tried to get them in Missouri, and it kind of fell through, and they were all down through the South. Did they have a big slot machine operation? In
fact, they were against slot machines because other people were starting to bring them into the social clubs, and they got an Italian guy in as DA, so he was their guy, and their first job was they wanted him to crack down on these slot machines because they were, you know, putting a damper on their pinball business.
And that money was probably going back out of town or something, or part of it was. I got a feeling. So
well,
you know, bring that up.
But the DA's point was he didn't want to do what they wanted because he knew these owners of these social clubs, and they were using slot machines to make, you know, to offset their own income, to make, you know, so he felt like they're not going to be able to get by without the slot machines.
Interesting. So speaking of that, now what about the political influence of the local government in Kansas City? It was not unlike Johnstown, I'm sure, and Chicago and all the other cities from basically here back east, in Kansas City back east. They really infiltrated the local government. Was it the same way?
Yep. The center of their operation was a pool hall called City Cigar. It was called City Cigar because it was 2 doors from City Hall. and the mayor would come in pretty much on a daily basis and hang out with them. City Cigar was the basis that was kind of the elite pool room where the lawyers and the, you know, managers of the department stores and people like that would hang out. There were a couple of blocks away right beside the mill gate was another pool hall for the working class guys. But yeah, they would pay off the cops, and there was that regular system where they would, you know, once a month or whatever, they'd let them know we're going to have to make a raid. So they'd give them a little warning, and there would be an old guy who they'd leave behind to take the fall, and they'd leave them with some betting slips and things like that. So, you know, that was just a regular routine, how they kept things going and kept, the newspaper could write up, okay, we busted these guys, and you know, we're doing our job.
Yeah, that was the same way in Kansas City. Periodically, they'd do a vice raid and take in a few people. And in our city, it was primarily the black gambling games that they would raid. And but they'd hit the Italians every once in a while and kind of give them like a $5 fine and have a bunch of headlines and then go on.
Yeah, and Gary, does this resonate with you? What I was struck by was how these guys, when they were coming up, my grandfather and and his brother-in-law, they really seemed to admire. Now these are guys who grew up in America. They weren't ones who grew up in Italy and came here. So they're very totally discriminated against, their generation, but they're in American schools and they're taught to admire American capitalism, and all these guys like Astor and Carnegie and Frick and these bigwigs, they just did what they wanted. They essentially ran their own mob outfits in many cases.
Yeah.
And so I think they really admired them. In fact, my grandfather's partner, his aliases were Ford and Forbes. So I mean, he was basically advertising his admiration for American capitalism. So I think in many ways, even this controlling the political races and paying people off and things, that's what they did. They were just copying.
I agree. And another correlation was when Italians first got here, of course, they had a strange language. They were darker complected. Yeah. And Irish were already here. They already spoke the native language. And they were kept, the Irish tried to keep the Italians out from businesses, from getting business licenses, from any government jobs, which is always a way out of poverty for poor people, is somebody gets a government job and pretty soon they get a couple of relatives there, to this day. Now Hispanics are doing it quite a little bit. And it's very similar to blacks, but blacks African Americans could never really push on through. Everybody's kept them pushed out. And so then they went to narcotics later on in like the 60s and 70s. They saw the opportunity in narcotics, where you got all these young men who are bright and not educated, but bright and have this native intelligence and good organizers. And they're looking for opportunity, and the underground economy is the only opportunity that's available for them, just like the Italians during Prohibition. I keep noticing that parallel every time I do one of these stories that goes across several generations.
Yeah, it's really the American way, but I was struck by that too. I wasn't aware of that before, that tension between the Italian and Irish communities, and it also had to do with religion. I mean, they're both Catholic, but they had very different styles. And I think that the Irish were kind of freaked out by this like Southern Italian. It was very like ornate and incense and all the saints and parades and
have parades carried. I've seen one of those parades in Spain. It's like, wow, that's something, carrying the crosses and all the embroidered robes and colors and carrying some kind of a saint maybe. And
and I went to, doing research for this, I went to the town that my great grandparents came from in Sicily. And they are full on with all that stuff still, all those saint parades, and and now I'm friends on Facebook with all these people.
Well, we're always afraid of the people that aren't like us. So to this day. Yep. So here's another kind of one last question here. We've been here for a while. Their boss had a rule: no Cadillacs, at least in Johnstown. You remember that? And did your family like really practice that? I knew a really good professional criminal, and our guys in Kansas City, they really were on the down low. They didn't have big fancy houses. They had kind of nicer houses, and they may have a Buick and a couple of them had Cadillacs, or one had a Lincoln, but nothing ostentatious, and nobody dressed that. And this guy told me, he said, when I go out of town, he said, I'll rent a limo and I'll stay in the nicest places. But exactly the same thing. When early on, when they're first married and they're coming up, they live in these real kind of ethnic ghettos where they're all packed into the house together. But then once they start to get established, they move to a nice middle-class neighborhood. It wasn't anything flashy. And they didn't drive Cadillacs. They didn't have tailored suits. They always wore suits, but never tailored suits. However, once a year, every summer, they spent a month or more
in Atlantic City, and they'd have this parade of cars going down Atlantic City, and they would stay at Haddon House, I think it was called. It was like the swankiest hotel in Atlantic City. They would rent a whole suite. They would have room service the whole time. So then they would really live it up there. That was okay.
Interesting. I did that myself one time with my kids. But it wasn't the swankiest place, but it was a pretty nice place, and I paid for it all. You know, kind of a once in a lifetime deal. Sometimes we do, but
yeah.
Well, I tell you what, things are the same but different all over, aren't they?
That's it. Yeah, that's it. And you know, what struck me was this, you know, how similar but different it is, the story that we know, the big city story, and the small, medium-sized town. It was in Johnstown, it was in Schenectady and Fresno and Amarillo and Butte, Montana, and all those places. It was the same thing, but it was a little bit more, I think, a little bit more innocent in those places.
Yeah.
And I think that was partly because, you know, as long as you were keeping things under control, you could operate in the open. But if you started murdering people or something, then the authorities are going to come in. The neighbors aren't going to want to be buying the, you know, the services you're operating and all that. But as long as it was under control, it went on for year after year.
You know, that's same way here in Kansas City. And I've noticed that, of course, I've talked to people that from that time, and even the older policemen that when I came on were about ready to retire. They were on during the 50s. And there was just more, I want to say, small time casual kind of corruption, and this blending of the mob, of the politicians, the city government, the county government, law enforcement. It was more casual and accepted. And it was every once in a while there'd be a new broom would sweep clean, but then they'd go on. And those guys, as we had a judge or city judge once told these guys, these vice guys back then, they brought in a bunch of black guys for a gambling game. He told these guys, he said, I'm dismissing all these charges. When you go down to the Kansas City Club and bring those gamblers in to me, then I'll do something about everybody the same. And so it was just this kind of casual, you know, that they provided the service. First the alcohol that everybody wanted, then the gambling that everybody wanted, the entertainment without TV. I think it's a fascinating time that in a way shouldn't look back at with nostalgia, but in a way it was a kinder, gentler time almost, it seemed like.
Well, it's interesting too that it's a product of American discrimination and American moralizing, you know, against gambling and against alcohol during Prohibition. And those two things created an opportunity. And discrimination created this need, like I'm not going to be able to go to college or you know, become a head of some company or something. So here's I'll open this franchise.
Yeah, you can make money this way. Yeah, oh yeah. I was just doing a documentary about a boat fraud in 1946 in Kansas City, and I was interviewing a guy who was an expert on black political activities during the 30s, 40s, and 50s, and he remarked that was, you know, the above ground opportunities were not available to people. That's where I really started noticing. They were just not. So the underground economy was available. And so African Americans and Italians who were being squeezed out, like I said before, but, you know, then they got political because they realized that what these English and Irish had done to come into the greater society is get involved with politics, is what Italians got involved with your local politicians. And it's just the American story. It's fascinating.
And, you know, you talk about, I mean, blacks, and of course the number starts in Harlem, and that's related to the mistrust that they have for banks, and how banks, I mean, they can't get a mortgage from a bank or anything like that. So, I mean, there's a reason they called a numbers game a bank. You know, a lot of these guys, I mean, in Harlem, they were, the thinking was, I'm going to play a nickel a day or whatever it is on my number. And 5 years from now or 20 years from now, it's going to hit big. And that'll be my CD maturing. That'll be my investment. You know, that's how they're going to play a bank without, and skip the official banks.
Oh yeah. Our black numbers guy, a guy named Peyton, he then formed a relationship with the top Irish politician, and they formed a newspaper together, and he ran his numbers bank and some joints, and and then when the white Republicans from the white silk stocking areas, every once in a while they swept all this out, and that just destroyed all those jobs and the numbers for a while. And of course it came back, but it is interesting. All right, Russell, this has been great. It's been an interesting discussion for me, particularly. I like finding somebody that has that kind of larger societal take on this organized crime, because mostly we look at it for the titillating stories.
Yeah. No,
but it's much more than titillating stories, isn't it?
Right. No, it was really part of American history in so many ways.
Yeah. All right.
Thanks.
Okay,
so much, Gary. This is great.
Thanks a lot. I'll get let me end this off in some manner and say, I'll just say, okay, thanks a lot, and say bye, and then I'll talk to you a minute. Okay. Well, thanks a lot, Russell, for being on the show.
Thank you.
All right. So I'll do something else after this, but it's been interesting. I've really enjoyed talking to you, Russell.
Thanks so much, Gary. It's nice to talk to somebody who's so knowledgeable on the topic.
All right. I appreciate that.
All right.